fun watercolour geese tutorial where we're going to recreate this painting that I did a couple of years ago. So let me tell you what I'm using. So I have 300-gram cold press watercolour paper which has been stretched and taped down to my board. To stretch your paper, all you need to do is soak it in a bucket of water for about 10 minutes and then tape it with gum tape to your board and leave it overnight, preferably, to dry back. That way you're going to prevent the paper buckling whilst you're doing your painting. We're going to be using watercolour paints and the colour palette is quite simple. We're going to be using some burnt sienna and yellow ochre, some ultramarine blue, red and some yellows. I have my 2 pots of water and the brushes I'm using are my trusted size 12 and size 6 round brushes. I also have a secret weapon. I have some salt. Now this is a mixture of normal table salt and a little bit of rock salt in there as well. So that's all of our equipment. Let's get started. Oh, I'm going mad tonight. It doesn't matter whether you're using tinned paints or tubes, okay? Ultimately, it's the same thing. If you squeeze some tube paint out and leave it to dry, you end up with the same as we have here. So I'm taking some yellow ochre. I'm going to pop it in my palette with a little bit of water. I want it quite dilute, so it's very watery. Clean that brush out. And we're going to start, as I say, with our goose on the left-hand side. Oh, one other thing to point out. It can get confusing in this picture of whose wings belong to whose, okay? So you notice there's some wings coming out the back here. It should actually extend a bit this side as well. They belong to the white goose, and she's got her wings outstretched. They come behind that bird, so that wing belongs to her, okay? He's also got some little stubby wings that he's starting to flap, but the long wings belong to her. I thought I'd point that out. Okay, let's go. So I'm going to leave his head alone for a moment and I'm going to take clean water and paint the clean water all over my first goose's belly, down to his chubby little legs. No, you don't want to put too much. You should see a nice shine to the paper, but it shouldn't be soaking wet and full of puddles. It should be smooth. So just go over it. Don't do his legs. Stop at his legs. Put a bit of water on his towel. And just smooth it over with your brush. Okay, now this is a very loose painting, so if you go over the lines, it really doesn't matter. Okay. So wet in wet technique. What that means is when we drop the paint into the wet paper, it's going to spread out and it's going to do some interesting things, we hope. So I'm going to take my yellow ochre, I'm going to pop it on his chest and down his belly. Now look at the motion I'm using with my brush. I'm not painting it, I'm tapping just with the end of the brush, tapping that yellow into his chest. I'm going to take that a little bit creamier so you can see the colour better. The creamier your paint, the darker the colour. The thicker your puddle, the darker the colour. Okay, so I'm just speckling his body. I'm going to bring a little bit of this up his neck as well. Why not? Okay, and down here between his legs, near his nether regions. So that's our first colour. And watch what happens. That paint spreads out into the water that we've put down already. Okay. Now I want you to mix. You're going to be doing some colour mixing as well. So you're going to take next a bit of water again. Burnt sienna. That's that reddy brown colour. Pop that in. That's quite a strong colour, very sort of a gingery brown. Clean my brush, and into that I'm going to mix some yellow ochre because that on its own is quite strong. Tilt that up so you can see. You see, that's quite a strong colour. I'll pop something under there so the light's not hitting it. So I'm going to put some yellow ochre in to calm it down a little bit. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Just pick up a little bit of that paint, not too much, and just tap around his belly, introducing another colour, go into the yellow in places, and I'm just moving it around with the tip of my brush. I'm going to come all the way over his chest, over the other side, up his neck, and down to his little chubby legs. So he's got this mottled look, and by applying the paint in this way, by tapping and lifting, you create that kind of feathered effect. So yellow ochre, then we've gone burnt sienna with some yellow ochre in. If you find you've put too much down or it's spreading further than you want, dry your brush and you're creating what's known as a thirsty brush. And then just put that thirsty brush in the paint and hold it there, and it will suck up any excess paint. Or you could use your tissue and just touch down and lift off whilst it's wet. Okay, now I'm going to turn my mixing palette around. We need some dark colours. He's kind of a browny grey colour. So we're going to mix our grey. And we're going to do that with burnt sienna again, that reddy brown. Pop that in your mixing well. Pop it in with a little bit of water. And into that, I'm going to take blue. In this case, it's ultramarine blue. Mix it with your brown. And what you'll find you get is a grey. If it's too brown, add a bit more blue. If it's too blue, add a bit more brown. I'm just mixing a bit more up here. So brown and blue. You could also use burnt umber. That would work as well. I'm not burnt umber. Yes, burnt umber. Any brown with your blue will make a grey. And here we go. Tapping in, touching in. I'm going to come along his breast. Just touching and pulling the paint down his belly, down the right hand side. Okay, remember to touch and nudge and pull it around with just the tip of your brush. We're not painting as such. I'm just going to add a bit more colour. I've used it all up already. Brown and blue. A little bit more blue this time. I want it a bit more grey. So the greyer, add a bit more blue. And again, just pressing down with that brush and putting these little deposits of colour in our bird. Come down his fat legs. Down as far as where his foot starts. Touch more blue again. The other good thing about mixing your own colours is as they separate out, you get more interesting colours. So I'm doing the same thing now over on the left hand side. Not so much here, just a bit. Just tap down and move it around. Go right up under his beak. Okay. I want a little bit of blue in my bird. So I'm going to add more blue to that mixture now. So instead of a grey, it's become a dark blue. Just playing around with that puddle. It's still got the burnt sienna in there and a bit of blue. I'm going to touch some blue along the edge of the brown. Then it will darken it even further. Here we are. Now remember, watercolours dry back lighter than when you put them on. So he may look quite dark at this stage, but that colour is going to fade out. As watercolour dries, it lightens. Okay, I'm just going to get from my other paint set some cerulean blue. You see this one here, this pale blue, a little bit of cerulean blue. Don't use white in watercolour. The white, the highlights come from the paper, okay? So never put white in with your watercolour. What will happen is, instead of being transparent, it will turn opaque and lose the beauty of the watercolour. Okay, I'm going to pop a little bit of this pale blue down here between his legs and on his towel. A couple of little bits up the top. Now when you mix the blue with the other colours, be careful with the yellow because you could end up with a green goose. I'm just going to spread that out a little bit. And he's much lighter underneath, down the bottom. So I don't want too much colour down here. Keep it nice and light and watery. So we've almost done a goose. How does that feel? Okay. In my goose, I've got carried away with playing with all those dark colours, okay? And I want to bring some highlights back into his chest. And some people say, oh, watercolours are really hard to use. If you make a mistake, you can't correct it. Well, that's not true. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a thirsty brush again. So wash your brush off and dry it out. I'm just going to lay that brush in his chest and lift off some paint and wipe it on my tissue. Go again. Touch down your brush, give it a little wiggle and wipe off on your tissue and go again. You see how we're lifting that colour out? And your brush, your thirsty brush, is acting like a sponge. I just want to bring a little bit of highlight back in. As I say, I got a bit carried away with his chest. Ideally, I should have left that bit and not put any paint there, but it's not a problem. There we go. So he's got a bit of a highlight on his chest. Okay, grab your salt. Get a pinch of salt. My pot's so small I can't get my big fingers in. I've just got a little pinch, and whilst the paint is still damp, I'm going to sprinkle that salt over the surface. Only do that when you've got the colours on and you're happy with how it's looking, because obviously once the salt is on, you don't want to be adding more paint to it. And watch what happens. Just watch your paint dry. How exciting. What will happen, you should see little spots of darker colour forming. It's tiny. Depends what salt you're using as well. If you're using rock salt or sea salt, you'll get bigger marks. If you use table salt, you'll get smaller marks. But it's going to create a pattern in the watercolour that you'd never be able to do manually. So it's a really good thing. Salt is our friend. Okay, before we leave him, I'm just going to add some brown back into my blue to make that grey again. Browny grey. And I'm going to bring in his feathers that are sticking out of the sides. So just brushing. This time I'm brushing down and flicking. Flick that brush towards you and lift it off the page. So you're creating some ruffled feathers right on the tip of the brush. We'll go the other side as well. So if you want to watch, and then I'll give you a minute to do it as well. So I'm going to move that out of my way because I'm going to put my hand in it. I'm going to come off of his shoulder, right on the tip of the brush. You don't want your brush too wet, and just flick and lift that brush off the page in that downward motion to create some ruffled feathers either side of his shoulders. A couple more. It's a lovely colour, that, mixing your blue and your brown. I'm a little bit in love with this painting already. I really remember how happy I was when I painted this the first time. It's such a happy painting, isn't it? Okay, what I'm going to do, now I've painted his wings, I'm going to take a little bit of blue straight from the pan this time, nice and creamy. I'm just going to do the same thing. You need some water on your brush and just pull and flick that same motion with the brush, a little bit of blue over the top. Because things aren't just one colour, are they? They're multiple colours, particularly animals. So a little bit of blue over the top of the brown. I'm just going to pause the recording a second and give you a moment to do that part. I don't want you to feel rushed. Okay, I wish I could stop that lady saying that every time I hit record. Now, the other thing about watercolour, guys, is we don't want to paint anything that's touching wet paint. So if we start painting our white goose next, there's a chance that this area that's overlapping is going to run. So we need to avoid that. So we're going to let that dry on its own. And we're going to move one along, we're going to go to the next one down. Now this little duck, it's not a duck, it's a goose. There's a little bit more orangey, a little bit more of that yellow ochre and burnt sienna coming through. So we're going to do, and we're going to come back to his head in a minute as well, okay? We've not forgotten his head. Clean water. This time, because there's no break between his head and his body, we're going to wet the whole area. I'm going to put my glasses on now. I can see what I'm doing. Same thing as before, pre-wetting over his body, spread that water out. Nice long strokes and stop before his feet. Watercolour is very obedient. It likes water and it doesn't like dry paper. So by not putting water on his legs, we're going to prevent the colour from bleeding down his body. Okay, and we're going to start off with yellow ochre again. Oops, I've got a puddle. Just smooth it out. Take some of that mustard yellow and I'm going to start in his face. Whoops, too much paint. You only want a little bit of paint on your brush. Coming around. You can go straight over his eye. Down. Tapping in. Once you get to the chest, just tap that brush against the paper and let the paint do its thing. And down. I'm going to leave some white this time. So down here, I'm going to leave some highlights. I'm going to try and leave some paper. Keep that paint well away. Leave a gap where you want some white highlights. So we've got our mottled yellow duck. I keep calling it a duck. God forbid. Okay. Whilst that's drying back, I'm going to mix up the colour we used before. Burnt sienna with a touch of yellow. Any brown will do. It's just that burnt sienna is kind of on the orange scale. So if you haven't got that, you could always add a little bit of red to your brown and then your yellow. Here we go again. So I'm going to tap that in. Not too much water on your brush. You should only be using the water that's in your puddle. And we're going to just tap this around over the top of the yellow. Tap and leave, tap and move on. Keeping some highlights in this middle section. We have our speckled duck. Now, if you're painting at the moment, stop for a second. I just want to show you what happens when you use this technique. I'll get another piece of paper and show you. Okay. I'm just going to paint any old colour on here, just to show you what happens. I'll use red. If I paint red and I spread the paint out with the brush in the traditional way, like doing a wash, you get a nice even colour. When you want something to look mottled in a different range of values in your paint, by touching down and lifting off, instead of spreading, you're creating these little puddles of paint which stay stronger and they start to spread out in that water underneath. That's pretty much what we're doing. Let me get rid of that red off my brush. Okay, so we're going to go back into our blue-brown mixture, our lovely browny grey, and we're going to do just like we did over here. I'm going to come round the top of his head, right on the tip of my brush. Use a smaller brush if you want to. We're doing this all wet into wet, so one colour bleeds nicely into the other. Come along the side. I'm leaving some gaps along this edge, along the right hand side, coming around his belly. Don't worry about the feathers that are sticking out right now. We're going to come back to those. And just again, blob. Put that colour down and then edge it around with the tip of your brush. Create that tiny puddle and then move it around. Come down the other side. Tapping around right on the very tip. And I've not reloaded that brush. It's still the same bit of brown that I started with. Creating some patterns in his feathers, a bit more up the top of his neck. Where I want the colour smooth, I'll spread it. Where I want it mottled, I'll touch and leave. Okay, touch and leave. Oh, if you want him a bit darker, take your paint a little bit creamier, less water, just mixing up a bit more of that colour, touch of brown, touch of blue. Whoops, my paints are alive, they keep jumping out the palette. Look, they're so sticky. These paints I'm using, I sell on my website. They're the artist pigments, so high quality pigments. Can you see they're shiny? Whereas normal watercolours are flat and matte. They're really creamy. Okay, so I've mixed this up a little bit darker this time with a touch more blue. And I'm going to go straight over that brown area where I want it darker and just tickle down, play around with that blue, bluey grey over the top. And a touch more up the top of his head. Okay, good, good, good. A bit more down that side of his neck. I think I need a bit more brown in him. A little bit more brown, so I'm going to make that browner again by just adding, playing with that puzzle, switching the colour just by altering how much blue to brown that I've got. If you want it more brown, just add a bit more brown. If it goes too brown, add a bit more blue. I want him a bit browner down here. I'm just going to go back in with my brown. It's a really good, I use this colour combination all the time. mixing greys, mixing browns. There we go, he's a bit darker now. Okay guys, once you're happy with that, I want you, if you're using tube paint, just pull a bit of paint from the tube. If you're using pans like me, we want a nice rich creamy colour, and we're going to do the feathers that are flicking out the side of the body. So I'm using the same two colours, brown and blue, but I'm picking it straight up with a wet brush from the corner of the paint. Brown and then blue, brown and then blue. End with the blue. And if you're not confident what colour you've got on your brush, have a bit of paper by the side and test it. It should be a rich grey. So with my tiny brush, let me just turn this round a little bit so I get a good angle. I'm going to come into the neck and do that flicking again. Flick out. You don't want too much water on that brush. Wet your brush before you pick up your colours. Don't add any more paint, any more water. And flick down right on the very tip of the brush. Create that ruffled edge. Let's have a couple over the other side too. Why not? There we go. It's just creating those feathers. A couple more. The drier your brush, the stronger that colour will be. Lovely. I'm just going to take my tissue and just lift a little bit out on that belly because it's bled together. I took too much out now. I should have used my brush. I'm just going to spread in, using the paint that's already down there to fill in some of the gaps. There we go. Now, I think I went mad with my salt on my first bird because he's gone very light. So I might have to sort him out later. I did go a bit mad with the salt. Right, let's go back to our first bird and to his head then. And in his head, I'm going to take that burnt sienna and yellow ochre mix that we made for this bird, and I'm going to paint that all over his face. Just spread that out across his head, come down his cheeks, but not his beak. Leave his beak. I'm just turning my palette round, back to the brown. Touch more blue in there. Browny grey again. And we're going to paint in his cheeks. Now, instead of spreading it, you're just touching into the wet paint, in his cheeks. Use the very tip of your brush, spread the paint around, and a little bit on the top of his head. So that was our burnt sienna and yellow ochre mixed, and then some of our grey brown into his cheeks. I'm just going to come down the side of his eye as well. So the light that's hitting our birds is coming from here. It's coming from this angle. So you'll notice that the left-hand side of our birds is lighter on all of them, and there's more darks on the right-hand side. Oh, someone's just joined. Okay. I'm just going to go back to my duck, or the middle duck, if there is a middle when you've got 4. But where I put that dark on his head, it looks a bit too solid. So you can reactivate your watercolour. Just tiggle back in with a damp brush. And I just want to spread that out a bit more. It was just looking too solid. Hi Pip, good to have you. Did you hear me? I don't think so. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording for a moment. Finish off where you are and then I'll come and see. If you've got a camera on your device, it'd be good if you can turn it on so I can have a look at what you've done. Recording. Okay, it'll be interesting when we come to the white duck because nothing that's white, animals. I remember one of my students in a pastel, she does a lot of pastel classes with me, pastel chalks, and she did a white dog for her friend on her own. And she used a lot of white chalk. And I was like, you need to really look at the colours that you see in a white animal, because they're very rarely white. It's just the highlights that are white. And she's always remembered that. Okay, so we're going to do the same as we did here with our last duck. Not our last duck. Why do I keep calling them ducks? I'm crazy. Okay, so we're going to have a highlight on this one. Let me bring that picture back. So the sunlight's hitting him here, just under the neck. So I'm not going to put too much colour there, but I am going to wet the whole bird. So maybe you're being too sparing when you're putting your water. You want a nice even coating of water. And you should see, when you hold your paper to the light, the shine on the page. It should be shiny. I don't know if I can get that on camera. There you go. You see that shine? That's how you want it. So that the paint has something to work with. Something when it lands that it can move in rather than just be static. So I've taken 1, 2, this is probably my third dip in the water pot. Now, if you're struggling to keep light areas, what you could do is dry that bit of his chest with a thirsty brush. Remember, dry your brush, make it thirsty. Watercolour doesn't like dry paper. So I've just dried an area there by sucking up that water with my dry brush. Now this little fella hasn't got so much yellow. He's got a bit of yellow in him, but not as much as the others. So for this guy, I'm going to use that mixture of burnt sienna and yellow ochre. Touch more yellow. I love mixing colours. And some people go out and buy sets of like 60 watercolours and you'll never use them all. It's better to have a smaller set and learn to mix them. Okay, so I've got my orangey brown. I'm going to come into that face. Not much paint on my brush, okay? Just don't add any water, just use the water in your puddle because we've already got water on the page. Spread, touch down. You need a touch more there. Touch and pull. So touch it down. You should create these little tiny puddles of colour and then you can move them around. I'm just going to mix up a little bit more of that colour. Keep running out. Keep it light. You're better to have a painting that's too light that you need to add some more colour in than go too creamy and too dark. So touching in and spreading, moving that brush to and fro. Kind of follow the direction of the feathers as well, guys. Look at the shape of the animal that you're doing. Touch that painting and pull it, nudge it around in the direction that those feathers are growing. In this case, around that belly and out the back. See how pale he is? He's not strong. Then, if you want him a bit stronger in places, just go back in and touch and lift. And then you can, if you don't like the look of it, just sweep it with the tip of the brush. So I want him a bit more gingery once we get past that light spot. You see how that works? He was very pale, and now, just by touching on with my brush and letting it sit there, nudge it around a little bit if you want, but don't spread it and don't have it too thick. Okay, that's colour number 2 then, which actually the same colour, just layering it and puddling it. That's my word for the day, puddling. Puddle goose. Okay, I do have a goose called Puddle actually. Oh no, that's a duck. Dizzy is the goose. Okay, well let's mix up a bit more of that grey brown. We've got our blue. You could use Paynes grey if you have Paynes grey, but to be honest, I really like mixing it. I've got Paynes grey in here, but I'm not using it. And some brown. Add a little bit each time and tweak that colour till you get that browny grey, a bit more brown in this one. So it's still a grey, it's a bit more brown. Whoops, my paints are definitely alive. Okay, let's go back up to the head, from around the top of the head, around behind his eye. And pull down, so just use that very tip of your brush, not too much paint, not too thick. Come along that back line. We're going to do the broken feathers in a minute. And then almost you could use the shape of your brush to touch and lift. Touch and lift. Leave gaps between your marks so the colour underneath shows through. You want to see the colour underneath, so leave a gap. That looks pretty, doesn't it? I like that one. Sometimes you just have good results with watercolour. Other days you can have a bad day. Okay, in we go. I'm taking him a bit darker. Just using my brush like a stamp. Let's come down the front of his neck, right up on the tip of the brush. I don't want much there. And down into his belly, onto his chest. Same again, touch, leave gaps between those marks so the colour underneath shows through. And he's looking very scruffy, this one. I just need to pull that in that direction, pull it round his belly with the tip of the brush. Just direct it, but try not to bury the colours underneath. And down his bottom end. Gorgeous. He's just lovely. Okay, just like before with my last one, I do want a few darker spots, so I'm adding a bit more blue to my mixture, and I'm going to just go straight in again, wet into wet, dropping wet paint on top of wet paint, and it will get darker as we put the blue over the brown, the bluey grey. He's quite skinny. My one's looking a bit skinny. I'm going to spread him out a bit. He needs to be a bit chubbier. There we go. He's been on a diet. I need to do that. I just like my sweets too much, and chocolate and cake. Okay. Just a few problems. Okay. Now for that feathered edge, remember what we did? We went straight into our paint. If you don't want to mess your paint up, you want a wet brush first. Wet your brush. Here we go. Let me show you. Dip your brush in, and then I want you to tap once, tap twice on your tissue to get rid of the excess water. So wet your brush on your tissue once, twice, and then go into your paint. Brown, blue, brown, end on the blue. And we're going to come along his back, right on the very tip of our brush. I want a bit more blue there. And flick those scruffy feathers off to the side. Scruffy him up a bit, and a little scruffy bit down his neck, the back of his head. More. We're going to do the same thing for his towel. His little bottom sticking out the end. So get a good position, touch down with the tip of the brush and flick it away. The drier the brush for this, the better. And if you hold your brush really light in your hand and just basically tiggle the paper, you'll get this broken mark. It's called dry brushing. Let me get my scrap of paper again. So dry brushing is when you take a brush with hardly any water on and you spread it over the paper and it picks up the bumps. So we're doing that but in mini form, just using the tip of the brush. And it will skip on those bumps of the paper. Free birds. Right, this one, you know that pale blue that I used before? I'm going to add a little bit of that in that area that I've left white. Just a little bit of that pale blue in there. It's only a touch, you don't really need it, but a touch more. Just going to lighten there. Okay. 3 geese. Nearly, they just need some beaks and feet, don't they? I'm not going to sprinkle salt on this one. I said I was going to show you another method of creating that mottled look. So he already looks quite mottled purely from the type of marks that we're making with our brush. Now if you want some more mottles, take just water on your brush, dip it in your pot and scrape it on the sides. Hold your brush horizontally above your paper and tap some water over your paint. Not too much. And what will happen, as that water lands, and it's starting to happen before my eyes, I'm going to bring this closer to the camera. As those little water droplets land, they disperse the paints and take you almost through to the white paper beyond. So it's pushing the paint out. Okay, just a little sprinkle of water. The great thing about watercolour is the most inexpensive, other than pencil, form, you know, normal graphite pencil. Okay, they're drying nicely. I'm not even sure we're going to need our hairdryer tonight. So we're going to go back to the beginning and we're going to add a little bit of colour into our beaks. I'm going to be using my light blue, cerulean blue. I'm using, there we go, cerulean blue. Nice and watery again, you don't want it too creamy. It will look too solid, you want it loose. And I'm going to use lemon yellow. Where's my paint? Bit of the lemon yellow or cadmium yellow light. Dangerous combination because we could end up with green. So on our first goose, I want you to bring some yellow on the left-hand side of his beak, just on the left-hand side. And we're going to let that dry. Whilst we're here, let's go down to his feet, and I'm going to add some yellow down his legs and into his webbed feet. You can see how light the colour is. I'm not over pigmenting it. That's a new word. Okay, so light yellow on the beak on one side and down his feet into his webbed feet. And then I want to turn that a little bit more orange. So I'm going to take my red. This is cadmium red, or you could use vermilion red. It's an orangey red. Can you see that there? Like tomato red. You don't want the more blue red. That's going to give you the wrong kind of orange. And I'm going to paint that straight over the top of the yellow and let it mix on the page. So you could mix an orange in there, or you can just layer your red over your yellow. I've just realised I didn't paint the top of his leg, so I'm just going to do that now. I'm going to take a risk. I hope it doesn't bleed. I missed a bit. Okay. Okay, now I want that yellow to dry before I put blue on the other side. Otherwise I'm going to end up with a green beak. So let's go to the next birds, and we just want blue for these ones. And we're working wet on to dry here. We're not pre-wetting because we want, it's only a tiny area. Just bringing a hint of blue into their beaks. Right on the tip of the brush, spread that blue down their beak. Very pale. If when it dries you want more colour, just give it another layer. And the same thing, we're going to go down to their feet with our pale blue this time. Go all the way over, do both of them. Okay, so they've got blue feet. Now into that blue, I'm going to add just the tiniest bit of burnt sienna. Okay, tiny bit of burnt sienna. Add it. You can pick it up from your puddle that we used earlier. You just want a little bit, tiny bit on the end of the brush. I'm going to come from the body and just into the top of the leg. Okay? Bit of your brown over the blue. We already know brown and blue makes grey, so we're giving a little bit of a grey colour in with that blue. Let some of it stay blue and just come from the body with that bit of brown. I'm going to put a little bit of this brown in my other goose's legs as well, just a little bit. Why not? I'm just going back to my third goose and just adding a bit more as I've got burnt sienna on around his eye. I left it a bit, there was no paint around his eye, so I'm just going back, adding it now. Okay, we're looking good. We've done a lot of the work. Now, remember I showed you how to lift out colour by taking a thirsty brush into your painting? Well, this fellow at this end is dried, okay? And I want a bit more highlight here. So even when your paint is dry, you can take a damp brush this time, not a dry brush, a damp one, and reactivate the paint. Gently rub your brush, very gently, backwards and forwards, and you can reactivate the paint and lift some off with the brush. Then dry your brush. Use a thirsty brush to soak some up. I just lost again some of that highlight, so you can always lift paint out, whether it's wet or dry. The main difference between your lifting out is when you lift out of wet paint, what's on the page will seep back because the paper's still damp, and it will slowly creep back and give you a very soft look. When you lift out of dry paint, and this isn't totally dry, if it was very dry, you would see where you'd lifted out. It would be more of a severe line, okay? So you would soften it with a bit of water around the edge, just to soften it back. We're doing lots of techniques tonight. Okay, we've got a troublesome one now because we have our white duck. Now, if you look at my painting, there's yellow and orange, and there's blue, danger zone. But it's fine if it goes a little bit green, don't worry. So again, we are going to come into our duck and wet with clean water all the way down that body. We're making it ready for wet in wet action. This time, I'm going to leave dry paper in this middle area, because where she is white is where the sun's hitting. Sun's hitting her chest. Now I've still got my yellows here, so we're going to be using lemon yellow or cadmium yellow light with a bit of water, and yellow ochre again, that lovely mustard yellow. And I'm also going to use a little bit of that red. Okay, so whilst that water's still wet, take your yellow, come in, doing exactly the same we did on the other bird, just tap in some colour around her body. Now, our friend's wing is dry, so that shouldn't bleed unless you rub your brush. So be careful where they're touching, not to rub over that brown. So we've got our base colour on, a little bit of colour in her head. Then I'm going to go into my yellow ochre. So lemon yellow first, then some yellow ochre. Touch it in and pull in. Touch and give it a pull. We've got the best bit to look forward to at the end as well, because we're going to put splatters all over our work. Okay, finally, on this yellow journey, I'm going to take some of that red, that lovely orangey red, and because we've already got yellow on the page, just like we did with their feet, I'm just going to put a few blobs of red over the yellow and let that mixing happen on the page. It's not too creamy, it's all light and pastel, gentle colours. Okay, I've took my yellow and I've added a tiny bit of red to it. So I want to show you both ways. So this is mixing it first. So you can either do that or you can mix your orange and add some pops of orange as well. I'm getting carried away here. She's going to end up being an orange goose. Okay, right, so some of it back up. Now, this is why I wanted you to have your hair dryers. If you haven't got your hair dryer, blow on it, okay? I want to dry her belly before I put the glue on. Okay, into the blue then. It's that lovely light cerulean blue again that I used before. Turquoise would look nice as well. If you have a turquoise, that would be fun to use. Something like that one, but I'm going to stick with the cerulean blue, but you can play around with these colours. Now, obviously, we want the yellow to be dry so it doesn't physically mix, but even putting blue over the top of yellow, when it's dry, you can still get that hint of green come through. Can you see that? When you layer blue over another colour, it's like looking through stained glass. I'm just popping some blue, but it's going to be less green than if you did it whilst it was wet, if that makes sense. It's a bit of blue, a bit of shadow. White colours, when they're in shadow, tend to have a hint of blue in them. I'm going to put some blue under her neck, where her beak's causing the shadow on her neck. And I'm going to bring a little bit into her wing that's going off, stretched out. That bit of wing that's touching our friend next to her. I'm assuming she's a girl. One important thing, guys, because everything underneath is dry, I'm going to take a little bit of water on my brush. So dip your brush, tap twice, and then I'm going to bring the water. If we look at her neck where I put that blue, remember we dried it, so that's just going to sit there. If I want that to soften, I'm just going to, without rubbing too hard, just bring a little bit of water up her neck to touch into that blue. Just gives it somewhere to bleed into. The same down the bottom. I'm going to add a little bit of water along the edge, just touching into the blue. Gives it somewhere to go. Otherwise you end up with a crisp line. We don't want crispy goose or crispy duck. Okay, we've left her wings, so let's do her wings the same thing. I'm not going to wet them first. I'm just going to pop a little bit of colour in the end of her feathers, in her wing here. And I've extended her wing behind this bird's head so it comes out the other side. A little bit of yellow. I've used the yellow ochre. And this time I'm going to be a devil and I'm going to put some blue on whilst it's still wet. A little bit of blue down the bottom of those feathers. Remember how we dealt with the feathers here? Under her wing, as she's got it outstretched. Where's the camera? As she's got her wing outstretched, we've got feathers coming off her arms. I'm just going to pull a tiny little bit of blue to indicate the long feathers coming off her wing. I'm going to add a little bit more blue in her belly as well. Little bit of water over the top just to soften everything. Just touch it on the wing, little bit of water. There she is. You could take some darker blue as well, so you could use the blue we was using earlier and drop a little bit of that in if you want to have a bit more stronger blue. It's a bit of ultramarine in there. Okay. Right, onto her beak and her feet. Back to our lovely lemon yellow. Into that beak. And let's mix up the orange for her legs, shall we? Let's mix our orange to take your yellow and your orangey red. If it goes too red, like mine has, add a bit more yellow in. Wet onto dry paper. We're just going to paint down her legs, into her feet. Okay. Now I want there to be a bit stronger colour in places, so I'm going to take my red on its own straight from the pan and just add it down her legs there. Make her legs a bit stronger, and you could pop a little bit in her webbed feet as well, just on the tip of your brush. Just again, it's not just one flat colour. I'm going to pop a little bit of orange in her beak as well. Why not? So we're on the home straight. There's one bit that I forgot to come back to. His beak. He's got half a beak yellow and the other half's not been coloured. So I'm going to take my pale blue and come down the other side of his beak. Poor bird. You could use grey or blue. And that way, just like we did with our white goose, it's not going to blend with the yellow that's on there already. A touch more yellow on the other side. I'm being daring. Okay, you've got options now, guys, for the eyes. You can leave it for your pen or go to your small brush, mix that same combination, don't use black, so brown, blue, brown, blue, and then just tap in tiny little dots either side of this one's face. We've got no highlights in the eyes to worry about, so pop those in or use your pen. I don't mind how you do it, and then pop in an eyeball. And our last duck. I keep calling them ducks, I really can't get out the habit. Okay. Now I'm going to give everything a nice dry before we come in to finish off with the ink pen and do some splattering. So give it a good dry. If you haven't got a hairdryer, just wait for it to thoroughly dry before you finish it. Here we go. Oops, I've dropped my hairdryer. Now remember, we put salt on this, so I want you to get a cloth, make sure it's dry first, and then I'm just using a big old brush and dust that salt off. And look at the pattern it leaves behind, look at that. Again, it is a bit of practice of knowing how wet your bird should be when you drop the salt on. Some of it will stick to the paper, so give it a rub with your finger. Get rid of all that salt. That's worked really well on that one there. Very effective. Now, as I say, you can leave this at this stage. We need to put the ground in as well. I forgot about some ground. Let's do that first, shall we? So I'm just going to use some yellow ochre again. We want a bit of shadow, otherwise our birds are just floating in the air. We can't have that, so I'm going to use yellow ochre. Wet on to dry. Not too strong, just come along under the feet. Pop a bit of colour either side of the feet. Don't worry about the feet that are in the air, because they're walking, aren't they? I'm just bringing that brush left to right, horizontally, under our birds. Go straight over the beak. Now this one's running. He's sort of half taken off. So just keep coming straight. You can bring it forward a little way. Not much paint on that brush. Mainly you want your motion to be horizontal. And I'm also going to add a bit of that grey colour into the ground. Just a few strokes of that grey where their feet are touching the ground. Or a little shadow of his feet in the air. Spread it out a little bit. And we have some ground. And kind of shadows as well. And it grounds them, as I say. So your ink pen. Let's say you could use a black biro if you don't have an ink pen. I want you to do this in a sketchy way. You don't have to do it, it's optional. But especially because we've got some light areas of our geese, it helps to make them pop out. So I'm going to sketch around. I'm not going to draw a solid line everywhere. I'll go around the beak. And come up the beak. You see how that pops out? And then around the head, I'm going to use my ink pen like a pencil. And in places, we're just going to sketch. And when you come round the edge of your bird, don't do a solid line like that. You want to come round the edge of your bird and flick. And use your pen in a very sketchy way. The good thing about adding the ink at the end is if your pen isn't water resistant, my pens that I use are water resistant, so I could do this at the beginning, but doing it at the end, you're not at risk of it bleeding with the water that you're putting down. So I'm just sketching around, add a few more feathers. You can come into that towel and flick backwards and forwards. Really sketchy. And I'm going to come into these outstretched wings. Again, if you want to, you can create more feathers. Just flick down like we did with the paintbrush, lifting that pen away at the end of the stroke. And if you want to, you could add some more feathers in the chest. Just sketch some in. Okay, so around we go, just retracing our pencil lines. Break up your line a little bit. Oh, let's not forget their nostrils as well. It's a good thing to put their nostrils in on their beaks. Their little nostrils there. And then into the body, flick in your pen. I'm going to do a few little tiny little dashes to create some more feathers in our white goose. Feathers again, down the wing. You see how it really comes to life with just a little addition of ink. I love the combination of the two, especially on things like this, where it's a little bit more illustrative, a bit of fun. Down those legs. And you don't have to do it everywhere. This guy doesn't need much ink at all. Outline the beak and put those nostrils in. You can strengthen the eyes with your pen as well. Nostrils. Just add in a few more feathers, a little flurry of pen marks in their bodies. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. Okay, final thing then, again optional, is the splatters. But it's become a bit of a trademark. I tend to do it on 90% of this type of painting that I do. And here, you can see I've used blues and oranges to splatter, picking up some of the colours that you've used in the painting. Before we launch straight into splatters, there's a few ways to splatter, and it depends what kind of action you're after. So in this one, because they're geese, I want it to look like splashes of water almost. So some of these blobs are big. So in order to get that effect, I'm going to go around the painting in places with some water. Not everywhere, just here and there, randomly, I'm going to put some water. And then practice your splatters first if you want to. You want to be safe. I'm going to mix up some more orange with my red and yellow. Load up that brush with lots of paint, really load it up. And then hold your brush horizontal to your paper again, okay? horizontal, and then just tap. And what's going to happen, where the paint hits the water, it's going to spread out, and where it hits the dry page, you'll get smaller, more intense colours. Okay, so you can either just go dry and just do some splatters, or you can wet and allow these blobs to open up. So, here we go. Another thing, actually, I just thought of another way. Let's do it this way. I'm going to just take clean water and splatter. This is a better option, actually. Just come into my head. I don't care if the splatters go on the birds. All adds to that sense of movement. I'm going to load up my orange and I'm going to splatter. The harder you tap, the bigger the splatter. You can try and avoid the geese. And then where it hits the water blobs that you've splattered, it will spread out. And then I'm going to take my blue, my light blue, and do the same. Load up that brush, twist it around, soak up all that lovely paint. Also, if you put your brush close to the page, you'll get a bigger mark than if you do it from higher, okay? Wonderful. I love splattering. Right, I'm going to stop. I'm going to do a couple more, and I'm not going to stop. I'm lying. I'm going to do a couple more orange. I promise I'll stop. Okay. So there we are, our finished gaggle of geese. And apologies for calling them ducks throughout the class. What can I say? Thanks so much for painting along with me. And I hope to see you back again soon. Take care and keep painting. Bye.